Okay, so this is the nail in the coffin for the objection here. You'll remember in my first video I parsed A begins to exist by coming into being, and then A begins to exist by being assembled. And Dr. Craig was attacked by saying begins to exist by coming into being. That never happened. Matter was always, the particles are always there. All that you get is little assemblages, but those aren't things. Well, in the part 2 of my video, I said, look, they certainly are things. A thing's not reducible to its parts. That was part of what I was getting at there, and we're going to really nail that down in this part of the video. But when Craig says coming into being, he says you can have it both ways. You could have creation or assemblage. That's why he talks about, on his website, he says, look, the atoms which make me up. Look, I'm assembled. I'm an assemblage of atoms. That's what I am. But I'm not reducible to my atoms. That's this diagram here, if you'll remember. Because we can switch out the atoms and still maintain the properties which make Dr. Craig himself. Now, Sisyphus Redeemed did something really interesting. He used this example. He said, look, I got a set of headphones, and I got an MP3 player. I put them together. Is that a new object? This is a whole new object in the world now? And he goes, no, well, he says you don't want to think that, because then if you think that's a new object, when I take the ball, I put the phone, the MP3 on top of it, oh, now that's a new object. Then I put this, that's an object, and then I put this as an object. I put this, then, well, look, a whole new object. And he wants to avoid that, because then you get objects dropping things all over the place. You get objects everywhere. Look at them all. We got a lid. That's an object. We got a marker. Look at that. We just toss them everywhere. We're getting objects all over the place. And he says, we want to avoid that conclusion. And the way to avoid that is to say that they're not really things. They're a state of affairs, like Wittgenstein. They're just an assemblage of atoms. Now, to get that from the what I'll call the MP3 argument, the argument from the MP3 and the headphones, is to do this. Here's identity. Questions of identity. How do we know that X and Y are different objects? Okay? And there are epistemological questions of identity concerning how we know that. Identity is two things being not the same thing. You've got A, you've got B, they're not the same thing. A is identical with itself, B is identical with itself. Then you have epistemological questions about how do we know that they're different objects. So I've got two identical twins standing in front of me. How do I know which one is which? Things like that. The second thing we have is ontology. And that's questions about what it means for something to exist. Something exists or not. A exists, B exists. How do things exist? What's happening is that Sisyphus Redeemed is pointing out to us an identity problem, namely, how do we identify if it's the same object? We took the MP3 player, we plugged headphones in. Is it a new object now? Is it a different thing? Like, that's an identity question. What kind, is it a new thing? Is the old thing gone, destroyed? You can't go from that to an ontological question. You can't say something exists or doesn't exist based upon whether or not we're able to identify it from other things that are like it. Let's say I have two identical twins and I can't tell them apart. I can't say, well, we don't have twins here because I don't know how to tell them apart. You can't do that. So, here's his mistake. Dr. Craig, here he is again, a little green bow tie this time. Got to give him different colors of bow ties. So, here's Dr. Craig again. Now, there's two ontologies here. There's the ontology of the atoms, right here. Now, the atoms exist, and there's the ontology of Dr. Craig, of the properties which make Dr. Craig himself. You'll remember from part 2 of this video, we had a setup where we were switching out the atoms, but still getting Dr. Craig. So we've got an ontology here. Now here's the point. The identity of Dr. Craig is determined here. It's not determined here. See, there's the ontology of there's two ontologies. There's the ontology of the atoms, and there's the ontology of Dr. Craig. Dr. Craig's atoms, those each exist. And there's also Dr. Craig, but he's not reducible to his atoms. Aristotle cast this out as the difference between matter and form. He said there's the matter the thing is made out of, and then there's the form of the thing. Now we obviously we cash it out differently. We're cashing it out in terms of identity and in terms of properties. But you get the picture. So there's the ontology of the atoms, and then there's the ontology of Dr. Craig. Now, just because the atoms cause Dr. Craig doesn't mean Dr. Craig is the atoms. That's a mistake. That's to confuse the thing, Dr. Craig, the properties, with the things that give rise to the properties. That's not a mistake you want to make. So we can identify each of the atoms all the way along. Each of the atoms has its own identity, and Dr. Craig has an identity, but this and this are not identified as the very same thing. To put it a little more clearly, you cannot reduce Dr. Craig to his constituent parts. Now, this is very important. Why? Well, the mistake that all of this type of objection make when they say there aren't things is to reduce out of the world things which really exist, and to say they're not things. So there is no Mike Young. There's just an assemblage of atoms. I'm not a thing. And they want to get out of this, but clearly, this here, that, is not that. That, the atoms and the way they're positioned, cause the properties. Now, Sisyphus, you should already know this because you've read Searle and you know Searle's theory of mind. And Searle talks about this. He says, look, man, take a single H2O molecule. It's not wet, but you put a bunch of them together, you get wetness. Wetness is not reducible to the parts. It's a macro-level function caused by micro-level processes. Well, you could take a similar approach here. The same kind of ideas at work here. The micro-level process is the atom. The macro thing that's different is Dr. Craig.